Good day, everyone. I am Jun Marnel Davies, and I am about to report the first part of Culture, Language, and Communication. The co-evolution of language and human culture. Culture and language are two related aspects of our lives. Way back to the roots of evolution, language evolved as human culture continues to grow. Thus, language is considered as a universal psychological ability in humans. Like in online warfare games, we acquire weapons as a tool to gain points or to kill. Language is also acquired to serve as a tool in communication. Humans are intentional agents. Language, on the other hand, helps our intentions to be communicated with other people or culture. Thus, language helps us to create large social networks larger than those found in non-human primates. Through the help of language, we enable ourselves to do these tasks and activities. Studies which are said on the book tells us the importance of language as one of the foundations of culture. Although language is universal to humans, each culture creates its own unique language. In order to understand the relationship of culture and language, we must In order to understand the relationship of culture and language, we must understand first the basic structure and concepts of language. We use din for the words and we have the way of how we should for example, the word basketball, court, and its objectives are subject, no? Or a person said phonemes are the most basic units of sound. Then we have morphemes, which are the smallest and basic morpheme is prefixes. In English language, the word again, all human trust, we still do not know where the language of language acquisition, di ba? In other words, yung mga meanings with distinct of phonology, syntax, and grammar factor wherein people who experience dryness, language is universal, yet they differ relatively on culture. A meaningful way to distinct cultural languages is through lexicons and pragmatics. A great example of how culture influences language is through reference. In English language, we use I and we irrespective of whom we are talking to or about, as well as regardless of our relationship with them. In Japanese language, they have different use of I and we depending on who you are talking to or what are you talking about. Figure 10.2 on our book shows Japanese words for self and other. Another example of how culture influenced language is on the counting systems. In Japanese language, they count objects that are round and cylindrical with suffix of hon. Then flat objects are counted by the Japanese with the suffix of mai. In English language, all objects, no, regardless whether they are round, they are square, we count them by numbers. Simply 1, 2, 3. There are certain languages that has no counterpart or translation with other language. For example, in Filipino language, we have the term kilig. There is no translation in English language for kilig, but they are often linked to the feeling of having butterflies in the stomach. This concept is related to hypocognition and hypercognition. Hypocognition is where a culture lacks words to differentiate emotional states, while hypercognition is when a culture creates many words to differentiate emotional states. Another structure of language is relative due to the culture is pragmatics. Additionally, there are two kinds of cultures which are identified by Edward Hall: high context and low context cultures. High context cultures promote communication in which many messages are conveyed indirectly in context rather than directly in verbal language. Countries which exhibit high context culture are Japan, Korea, other Asian countries, and the like. In contrast, there are cultures that promote direct communication in which messages are conveyed primarily and directly in verbal languages, and the effects of context are minimized, which is called low context cultures. United States of America, United Kingdom, Australia, and other Western countries exhibit low context cultures. Now, ano nga ba tong high context culture and low context culture? So, 'di ba, madalas nating makita sa mga Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, they say hi, hello through bow. That is an example of a high context culture wherein they do not rely on verbal communication, rather on the non-verbal behavior. That is in contrast with low context culture. Low context culture relies on verbal communication. No, like for example, 'di ba, Americans, British people, they are verbal persons, like they say hi, they say hello, like that, no? Next is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is also known as linguistic relativity, refers to how language influences our thoughts. This is when people tend to think relatively due to language. This hypothesis helps us understand the differences and similarities of cultures regarding thoughts, behaviors, and languages. For example, in USA, it is acceptable to call older friend by name. No, sa US, sanay sila na tinatawag nila yung mga kaibigan nilang mas matanda sa kanila, no, by name. Like, "Hi Albert," "Hi," ganyan. Diba ganon? Sa Korea and other Asian countries, no, they have honorifics. Diba? In Korea, a man like me, if I will call older male, I will call him Hyung. Then if female, I will call her Nuna. For female persons, no, for female, they call older sisters as Oni, and Opa for male. Okay? Other studies which are mentioned in the book challenge the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. They found different holes and insufficiencies about the study. Pinker 1995 concluded that many of the earlier studies claiming linguistic relativity were severely flawed. He then pointed to the fact that we can think without words and languages, suggesting that language does not necessarily determine our thoughts. He cited evidence of deaf children who clearly think while lacking a language but soon invent one, of isolated adults who grew up without language but still could engage in abstract thinking. Also, 'di ba, babies who have no words can still do simple forms of arithmetic. That is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Next is the verbal language. Verbal language is not the only component of communication. It also involves nonverbal behaviors. Nonverbal behaviors are all behaviors that occur during communication which do not include verbal language. All of us are familiar with gestures, no? It is the hand movement that illustrates what we are saying. Now, speech illustrators are non-verbal behaviors that accompany speech and are used to illustrate or highlight speech. Diba? Yan yung mga, tulad nito, pag nagre-report tayo, meron tayong paggalaw ng kamay, diba? Yan yung mga gestures. On the other hand, we have emblems. Emblems are non-verbal gesture that carry meaning, like praise or sentence. No? An example of an emblem is a bow from a Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and the like, which means reverence or greeting. Iba kapag nagbabaw sila, para nag-hi sila, nag-hello, rumerespeto sa inyo. Yun yung emblem. Okay? Next, culture and gaze. Right? Culture and gaze. A gaze is a powerful non-verbal behavior due to its origins from animals. A gaze is often linked to dominance, power, aggression, affiliation, and nurturance. In the Filipino culture, looking directly in the eye is a sign of respect while communicating with other people. Other culture may find that look in the eye as a sign of disrespect. Another important channel, no, of non-verbal behavior is voice. Words are conveyed by speech and the voice, but the voice also has a number of characteristics that go beyond speech in terms of conveying information. No? And lastly, language is also varied on culture and interpersonal space as well as touch. Proxemics, no, is the use of interpersonal space and an important example of a non-verbal behavior. Hall 1966-1973 suggested 4 different levels of interpersonal space. That is intimate, personal, social, and public. Sussman and Rosenfield 1978 stated that interpersonal distance helps to regulate intimacy by controlling sensory exposures because the possibility of sensory stimulation is enhanced at closer distance. For this reason, it makes good sense that cultures regulate the use of space. A such regulation is necessary for social coordination. Violence of space bring about aversive reactions. So, for example, diba, yung mga conservative countries, they put spaces or boundaries, no, between men and women to regulate sudden emotional fluctuations. Parang, diba, tayo, dumidistansya tayo sa other sex or other gender to eliminate yung mixed signals, diba, or yung kabastusan. No? Other cultures, for example, sa atin kasi, nahihiya pa kapag kumbaga magkaibang sex or orientation, gender, ganyan. Pero sa mga ibang bansa tulad sa Spain, diba, western countries, at okay sa kanila kung yung kahit other gender or sex, diba, ang pagbate, beso, kiss, close, may medyo intimate. Ano? Next is haptics. A logical extension of interpersonal space is touch. As touch requires close physical contact, touch is another powerful non-verbal behavior and is known as haptics. Just as cultures regulate space, they also regulate touch. That's the ending of my part in chapter 10. Thank you.